Firstly, willkommen.
Thank you very much. Okay, very good. It's a pleasure to be with you here. As I was introduced, thank you so much for the welcome. I live in the Philippines, so I appreciated seeing some people from where I live in the Philippines. Some service, and I see some people in the crowd. I grew up in Germany, but moved as a child back and forth between Germany and the United States. So I feel I'm part of many different places, and now I feel like I belong to Asia as well, since my family and I are living in the Philippines. I want to share with you an old story today, one that most of you are very familiar with, but hopefully we can extract some new and profound messages from it. I have to tell you that growing up in Germany, we did not have any church schools. And so when I entered the age of 6, 7 and entered school, I was a bit sheltered. My parents had told me all the Bible stories, but none of the other stories. I didn't know about Snow White or Cinderella. And I needed a crash course in, by the way, German fairy tales. Many of them are Brother Grimm stories, some of them Hans Andersen. I did not know many of them. We had art class, and the teacher would say, draw a picture of Cinderella, and I would have to copy what my neighbor did, because I didn't know the stories. So at that point, my parents said, we better give him some general education as well. And my dad started reading to us stories. And I don't know for what reason, but he started with 1001 Nights. You, of course, know the stories. Amazing stories, especially for us in Europe, of the Orient, of fantastical events, and stories, and dresses, and clothes, of a king, Shahrazad, who is upset about his wife's unfaithfulness. And so he promises that he will kill a virgin girl every morning. And a wise woman, the daughter of one of his ministers, says, I will voluntarily be one of these women, Shahrazad. But she does something very unique. She tells the king or the sultan or whatever it is, it's not actually quite clear, she tells stories. Fantastic, beautiful stories. And right when she gets to the most interesting part, she says, see you tomorrow. And this man is captivated by these stories. And for 1001 nights, he listens, fascinated by these stories, till he realizes she's been telling these stories to save other people's lives. And he gives her her freedom and the freedom of all the remaining virgins of the empire. The stories of Shahrazad. Amazing stories of Aladdin, of Alibaba and the 40 robbers. Amazing stories. But for me, they carry a much deeper meaning than the stories themselves. For me, it was the time that I had with my father. My father never put us to bed. He was always busy in the evenings. He was gone in the evenings. We'd see him for breakfast, but never for supper. We'd see him in the morning, but he was never there when we came home from school. He was working. And yet, for this little bit of time in my childhood, and I can't exactly say how old I was, my dad would read these stories in their unabridged version, the full-length version. And he would read 1 or 2 paragraphs. And then he'd say, tomorrow we'll continue. Completely in the style of Scheherazade, and we were fascinated. In fact, I loved this time with my father so much in these stories that I don't remember the many, countless hours my parents told us Bible stories. But I do remember the time with my dad and 1,001 Nights. I'm sure my parents spent a whole lot more time with Bible stories. But these are the moments that I remember and cherish. Because they had more than just the story, more than just the characters. There was truth behind it. The truth of a father that loved me, that would take care of me, that would read stories. Stories are never just stories. We sometimes think that the stories, even the stories of the Bible, are wonderful things for children. And I have 2 little girls. One of them is 10 months old, and the older one is just turned 3 years old. We read them stories. But it's easy to categorize the stories that we read as children's stories. We label them and we put them away. They're great for children's Sabbath school. But do they mean something to us? And I want to invite you to look at 2 stories from the Old Testament and look at them in a fresh sense this morning. The stories are from Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2. And since it is the Bible, we will take them time to read it. You know the stories. Listen with fresh ear to these stories. That's my invitation to you. We start in Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. The stories of Jacob, Joseph, and Benjamin, they have just passed. That was Genesis. Now we begin in Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Here are the 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All of the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died. And all his brothers and all that generation died as well. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. This is the introduction. And it presents us with a problem. They were exceedingly great. They started off as 70, actually just as one, then it was 70, and now we can't number them. And that produces a problem. We see that in verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies in a fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for the Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Quite the story. And a question that occupies us as we read this is, we just read about Joseph and his brothers, and they died, and in the next verse it says there rose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. How can you not know Joseph? I mean, he was an important figure. He saved the Egyptians from starvation by his crafty planning, his wise counsel. He was the second in command. I mean, we know our history. We know who ruled our country. We know the good and the bad. How can you forget Joseph? Before we deal too harshly with the Egyptians, we need to understand them in their setting for just a moment. And allow me to kind of reconstruct the picture that the Egyptians are facing. They are the empire of the world. They control vast regions of the world. And yet, they've run into a problem. This exceedingly huge amount of migrants in their country. And they've been there for a while, 400 years to be exact, of migrants that have not integrated. They haven't joined the way of life that the Egyptians are enjoying. In multiple ways. Number one, they don't worship Ra, the sun god of the Egyptians, or any of the many other gods of the Egyptians. They're sticking to their, from an Egyptian perspective, crazy god Yahweh, who hasn't made an appearance for 400 years. What kind of God is it that is quiet and silent, and that just leaves them there to rot as slaves? That's what the Egyptians must have been thinking. Also, they're still dealing with their animals. They're still doing animal husbandry. That is so unsophisticated. They didn't even appreciate it when Jacob and the family came. They said, well, you know, you have these smelly animals, and we live off the Nile. We are an advanced culture. We are sophisticated. We don't deal with dirty, stinky animals. We have grain. We are settled. We have nice houses. We're not people that move from place to follow herds. And so they pushed them off into the land of Goshen because they didn't want to be too close to that kind of environment. That's how it started off. And in 400 years, nothing has changed. In fact, when we find out that the Israelites later leave, they go back to their migrant lifestyle, their gypsy lifestyle of roaming around with their animals. That's so unsophisticated. We as Egyptians are such an advanced society. How can they not adopt our ways? Integration has not been successful. These are still the outsiders. And now they're growing to be a huge mountain of people. They are taking over our country, and they feel threatened. In fact, we can clearly read about the threat that they're encountering. The Pharaoh doesn't know quite how to deal with this problem that he has. How should we do with these? How should we deal with these migrants in our midst? He says, well, what if? And with that, he begins a politic, a way of dealing out of fear. What if something happens? What if they grow too big? What if? What if? What if is always fear-driven. It's always fear-based. It's not based on reality. Notice what he says. He says, what if they join the enemy? What if they become terrorists in our own country? What if? What if? It was not based on any reality whatsoever. But what if? With that, he creates an atmosphere of fear. He sows fear to deal with the problem of these people. Fear drives us to do all kinds of things. Fear will drive the next one. The Pharaoh is shrewd. He actually tells his advisors, let us deal shrewdly with them. Let us be wise in how we deal. And in fact, he is very wise in how he approaches. First of all, he uses fear tactics to get the people, the Egyptians, on board. Second of all, he wants to deal with this issue, so he does a twofold thing. He makes them slaves. This does two things. Number one, he can control them. And number two, they have to build him his palaces, his pyramids, his brand. They have to do and build and give him a great name. The Egyptians lived off of their great buildings. How do you become famous? If you chisel your name into the pillar of an amazing building. That's how you become a person for the afterlife. That's how you become famous. Why should I do that myself? I will make the Israelites my slaves. I control them, and they actually do something positive for me. My great name, my great achievement. He deals shrewdly. But even that doesn't solve the problem. At the end of what we just read, after all of this, they are still multiplying. The more he oppresses them, the more they are multiplying. This isn't the real solution, it's actually causing the problem even more. They are continuously growing. The more he does, the faster they grow. He has to take a second approach. Tactic number two. We continue reading in our passage in verse 15. Then the king said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But, oh, this is an amazing and important but. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? But the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. They are shrewd as well. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. It's the third mention that the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then the Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Tactic number 3. Let's look at tactic number 2 for a moment. Why doesn't he just go and kill the male children himself? Well, in no society is that an acceptable thing to do. Not even an Egyptian. Not even with migrant children that you don't value. Not even with slave children. Can you do that? And people will say, good job. It just doesn't work. So he is shrewd. Let somebody else do my dirty work. Oh, and what better than to actually even take the Israelites themselves and let them do it to themselves? I have no contact. Why would I as a king talk to the lowly midwives of slaves? If there's any question or doubt, why are suddenly all the male children dying? I'll say, it was the midwives. It's your own problem. Don't blame me as Pharaoh. It's dealing very shrewd. He is untouchable in this scenario. He thinks that he's in control of the situation. He calls these women to himself. That's not unimportant. And that's what you would do if you want to impress somebody, force somebody to something. If your boss wants to tell you that you have to shape up for some reason, he will call you to his office. He will not go to your office. He demonstrates his power over you. And the king does the same. In fact, imagine being a Hebrew midwife living among slaves, and the Pharaoh himself calls you, and you enter these amazing palaces. You've seen pictures. Maybe you've even seen the Egyptian palaces in person. They're still standing today. Impressive. Huge. Today, all the color has been gone, and they all look beige and tan, but they used to be filled with amazing colors. You walk in there, surrounded by guards, in these tremendous ceilings with murals on the walls, oversized, 3-4 times the size of Lifetime. And what depictions do you see? As you enter the throne room of the king, you see people on these murals killed and stabbed. The king wants to impress upon you, this is how things happen to the people that don't obey me. I subject everyone. And they depicted these scenes in gore, detail that impressed everyone. Foreign ambassadors of countries would bring all kinds of gifts just to appease this apparent incarnation of the gods themselves. This is where 2 women are brought in, 2 midwives. And they're told in no uncertain terms, it's either you or the children. Who do you want dead? This is what's going to happen. Look at the walls. This will happen to you. And these women must have been afraid for their own life. And they had very good reason to be afraid of their life. If a king wants little children dead, what value are you? And yet you are 2 women that are introduced with a little but they feared God. I'm sure they feared the king of Egypt, but they feared God more. And that was more. I'm sure they were afraid of the consequences, but they And these two women, not only do they subvert the genius plan of the Pharaoh, the mightiest man of the world, they also expose it, otherwise we wouldn't know it. Two women against the mightiest man in the world. Two midwives against what the Egyptians believed to be the incarnation of the gods. A God himself. This is the story of God. The story of God using people in surprising ways. A God that sides not with the civilized culture of the Egyptians, but the rather simplistic and primitive people of the Israelites. Those are his people. In other places, God will say, I did not pick you because you were grand among the nations. I picked you because you were my own. Not because of any value in yourself, but because I chose you. It's God who chooses. God who takes sides. God who gives strength. God who blesses. The two things that the king is afraid of are the increase in children and the potential terror that could happen. Surprisingly, these are the two things that God will be doing to push his buttons. Not the Israelites. The Israelites don't grow by themselves. God blesses and God increases them. And he's so afraid of terror that will happen, that these people will have a war within Egypt. And notice what will happen many decades later when God confronts Pharaoh and destroys the country from within with 10 plagues. The two things that Pharaoh is afraid of will actually happen. Those are the buttons that he needs to have pushed. But it is not the Israelites. They have no power. It is the God of the Israelites that is in charge. The Pharaoh thinks he is shrewd. But in fact, it is God who is in control the whole time along. The question is, how could he forget Joseph? Why did he not remember the amazing things, the visions, dreams? Writing this down, Moses wants us to compare two people. He tells us the story of Joseph at the very beginning for a very good reason. He wants to portray a wise Pharaoh and a foolish Pharaoh. The wise Pharaoh of Joseph and the foolish Pharaoh of Exodus chapter 1. The wise Pharaoh of Joseph listens to a prisoner in his dungeons. Somebody that is worth nothing, but he listens to the counsel and recognizes God's voice in the words of a prisoner, the prisoner Joseph. One that has a shady past. Oh, there's rumors that he didn't deal wisely with a woman. That's the rumors that are told about him. But he listens to him and hears God's voice. That is the wise Pharaoh of Joseph, and he leads his people wisely. Now we see a foolish Pharaoh that thinks he is wise, that thinks he is shrewd, and yet he is foolish. He does not listen to the voice of two women. The most important thing for the pharaohs was their name. They chiseled it into everything. They actually even, next to all the chiseling, the name was circled. It's called a cartouche. The name to point it out and bring it forward in all of this chiseled masonry, the name of the Egyptian people, the Egyptian pharaohs circled so that it sticks out. That was the most important. That I have a name is the most important thing. The surprising thing in the story is that the Pharaoh has no name. We don't even know quite accurately where to place this Pharaoh. Their system of thinking, you had to appease the gods. You had to, if things weren't going well for you, you had to bring an offering. And that could be a costly offering. I visited India many years ago, several years ago, and taught a class there. They took me to some caves where people today still worship phallic symbols in hopes that they will have their fertility restored. A group of women around this stone slab that were worshiping this object in order to improve their fertility. They brought incense and all kinds of other things to appease the gods that they could have fertility. The fertility god of the Nile needed to be appeased. Apparently, the Egyptians weren't having enough children. So what better thing than to give a child sacrifice? So he uses their religion against them to commit a form of genocide. Take all the boys, throw them in the river. That's how you can regain, as Egyptians, your fertility. And the people, desperate because they lacked fertility, would have followed this idea. This is how he convinces people. That's why he doesn't use the military. He can get all of the Egyptians to gang up on the Israelites. That's why the plagues, when they come back, are also affecting all the people. All the people had been part of this endeavor, not just the Pharaoh himself. Shrewdly, he gets the whole people behind him, cast them into the Nile. You know the story, though, of what happens. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket, made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch, put the child in it, and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him." This story is even more famous, maybe even more famous than 1001 Nights. We know the story very well, but some of the details need to be revisited. Notice again, the king deals shrewdly, and again, it is 2 women that subvert his plans. We have 2 women in chapter 1. Now we have 2 more women, and these 2 women each have 2 helpers. It's a total 2 and 2 and 2, 3 series of 2. We have 6 women in total that begin the book of Exodus. 2 women. The first woman is introduced as daughter of Levi. That's what it literally says in the original Hebrew. Why does it say daughter of Levi? For our modern translations, it translates it as a Levite woman. And that's accurate, but there's more to the story than that. A daughter of Levi. 2 reasons why it identifies this mother, who is never named in the story, as a daughter of Levi. Number 1, daughters were even less valuable than women. Now, women didn't have a good social standing at the time, but at least a woman could attain a certain status She would have a household. She would have a maid. She could have a servant. You remember the story of Sarah, right? She had Hagar. She had a certain position. She had a certain rank. She organized the house. She had attained a certain value in life, the highest you could reach as a woman. But this woman is presented to us as less than a full woman, just as a daughter. In the eyes of the Pharaoh, her rank is nothingness. He hasn't learned from the previous story that the threat is not from men, the threat is from women to his entire empire. The two midwives were the threat before. And he ends the story, oh, leave the daughters are fine, don't worry about the daughters, just kill the boys. But the actual threat to his kingdom is from daughters. They will turn the empire upside down. He has misjudged. He thinks he's so shrewd. He thinks he's so wise. He thinks he's so amazing. He thinks he's so powerful. And yet he misses the most obvious thing over and over again. It's the women that will cause the downfall of his empire. Two women. The daughter. There's a third reason why she is introduced as the daughter. Because the author, Moses, when he writes a story, wants us to connect two people. We've had two midwives. Now we have two daughters. The daughter of Levi and the daughter of the Pharaoh, right? Two daughters. He purposely wants us to connect these two women. One is a Hebrew and the other is an Egyptian. One is a very lowly person, the other one is a lady of the court. Two daughters. Two that break the mold. Two that don't follow the king's orders. One even out of his own household. Two women that trick him back. Notice what the first one does. The daughter of Levi. She says, you want me to throw children into the Nile? I'll do it. I'll throw my son into the Nile. But I'll put a little ship around him first. You think you're so shrewd? I am shrewd too. If any boy cries, if the child should cry in the little basket, well, obviously, where the people are throwing kids into, of course there's constant crying on the Nile. That little cry of the baby in the boat is not going to be heard. It's the best place to hide the little boy. She is a smart woman. And she has incredible faith. The text says she built an ark. This term ark is only used 2 times in the Old Testament. One is the obvious ark that you know. Genesis 6, 7, and 8. It's the ark of Noah. The ark that saved in the midst of floods. The ark that saved 8 people and all the animals. God protected the ark. And how did they build it? Out of wood and pitch and tar and bitumen. And what does she do? She uses the reeds that she has, the trees of Egypt, and she puts bitumen and pitch around it to keep safe. 2 arks in the Old Testament. One that saved Noah and his family, and the other that saved Moses. Only twice is this term used in the entire Bible. She has the faith to say, if God saved Noah in an ark, he will save my child if I build an ark for him as well. She is not only wise, she is incredible, believing, trusting, and faithful to God. And this trust of an unknown, unnamed woman so far is stronger than any power the king himself has. This allegiance to God will subvert the most ingenious plans of the rich and powerful by faith. But there is a second daughter. Imagine the situation she's in. The daughter of Pharaoh. We quickly write her off as a heathen and pagan, but the story makes no mention of it. She is the one that saves the child and draws it out of the water. She is the one that takes this child home. To whom? Where does she live? She subverts her father straight into his face. He says, kill all the boys. She saves the boy. He says, throw them into the Nile. She takes it out of the Nile. What kind of faith does this woman have to take this boy home and say, I know he's a Hebrew. She says that explicitly, but I'm taking him home. She has faith in God to protect her from the wrath of her father. And that's how she's presented in the story as well. She's a woman of faith. Maybe not an Israelite, but she is a woman of faith. These two women are purposely contrasted. One is the physical mother. The other is the adoptive mother. She takes him. She names him. That was the rite of adoption. By naming a child, the child, I say, is mine. That was the official declaration of adoption. The lively mother, the adoptive mother. One puts the child into the Nile, the other takes it out of the Nile. One tells the sister to watch it and be next to the Nile. The other, the daughter of Pharaoh, tells her servants, go get it. Both of them have alliances with other women to help them in their process. Two women that subvert for the third time the plans of the mightiest man of the world. 6 women in total that take on the biggest ruler of the world, expose him, expose his evilness, that are shrewd, that are faithful, that God uses. God uses them to begin the Exodus. The story of the Exodus and the book of Exodus does not begin with Moses. In fact, Moses is a very side figure. Even the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, Moses is only the one that says what God says. Moses is only the ambassador. Moses is not the one fighting the Pharaoh a couple chapters later. It is God who deals with Pharaoh. Moses is just the guy that goes in between and delivers the messages. The real Exodus begins with 6 women that have the courage and the faith to stand up. See, we think it's all about power and title and prestige, sometimes about gender, and God says it's all about faith. And it doesn't matter who you are. You can be a woman, you can be a girl, you can be a heathen, a non-Israelite, you can be an Israelite, you can be a midwife. All the things that are so important for us. Title, honor, position in society, wealth. We think those are the people that can make a difference. But this story tells us that it's none of these things. It's people who are committed to God. Because God writes the ultimate history books. And those are very different than the history books we find in shelves. Stories. Stories are not just children's stories. Stories contain deep truths that go beyond, that show us God's character. See, the Bible is not a list of doctrines. It is a list of stories. I used to answer the question, what do you believe in? By listing a series of points. At some point it was 27, then it became 28. This is what I believe in. But that's not what Stephen, when he was being stoned to death in Acts, that's not what he said. Here's a list of things. He told stories. Because God is a God of stories that reveals himself through the subtle acts of history. How he intervenes and how he guides and how he values things differently than we do. The Bible is a collection of stories. And so I've changed the way I answer the question of what do you believe? It's not a list, it's a person. It's not a catalog, a creed, or a catechism, an answer, question, answer, response. It is God who is active in history. God who saved the Israelites, though they were not worthy in all measures that we would attribute to them. But a God who acted and who still acts. A God who seeks us out and who encourages us along the way. That is the God that I found. A God of history and a God of stories. I challenge you to read the stories of Scripture